The heat clung to the night, thick and stifling, as Lucas slammed the door behind him, leaving the suffocating tension of his home. The dim, flickering street lamp outside his house did little to lift the weight from his chest, the echoes of another argument with his mother still buzzing in his ears. It was always the same, her sharp words about money, her heavy sighs about how everything fell on him. He needed to escape. He hurried to his car, an old beat-up Corolla, threw his bag into the passenger seat, and gunned the engine. The sound of the motor filled the silence, giving him a brief respite from the constant pressure that lived inside those walls. Tonight, like so many others, he was headed to the one place where his mind could finally breathe, the park. It wasn't far, just a 10-minute drive. The trees loomed large as he approached, their shadows stretching long under the faint moonlight. The park was empty, as it always was at this hour. That's why Lucas liked it. No one to talk to, no one to ask questions. Just him and the bars. He walked over to the pull-up station, the metallic bars cool beneath his hands. The night air was thick, but it felt good to be outside, away from the clutter of his life. As he hoisted himself up, his muscles strained, but the burn was a welcome distraction. With each pull, each rep, he pushed away the frustration, the guilt, the anger. The rhythm of it all was familiar. This was his escape. Just him and the night. As he worked through his sets, Lucas let his thoughts drift. The gentle rustle of the leaves, the chirp of crickets, and the soft breeze moving through the trees created a rare sense of calm. But as he pulled up for the final time, something about the stillness felt different. The air wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally so. He dropped down, wiping sweat from his forehead. And then, he heard it. Lucas. He froze. The drive back home was quiet, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The familiar streets felt different now, darker, more alien. He pulled into the driveway, the glow of the single street lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. As he stepped out of the car, something caught his eye, a figure standing beneath the street lamp a few houses down. Lucas froze, squinting against the dim light. A man, tall and gaunt, stood just on the edge of the light's reach. His face was obscured in the shadows, but Lucas could feel his eyes, feel them watching. For a moment, neither of them moved. The man didn't say a word, didn't take a step, but his presence felt invasive, like he didn't belong there. Lucas' skin prickled with unease. Who was he? What was he doing there, just standing and staring? Lucas' heart thudded painfully in his chest, a wave of anxiety crashing over him. He quickly turned, fumbling with his keys, and hurried to the front door. His hands shook as he shoved the key into the lock and burst inside, slamming the door behind him. He locked it quickly, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Pressing his back against the door, he glanced through the peephole, hoping no, praying that the man was gone. The street was empty. Lucas' muscles relaxed slightly, but the tension never fully left. The man's gaze, his silent, watching figure, it haunted Lucas even as he forced himself upstairs to bed. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of the man standing under that street lamp. And that whisper, his name, still echoed in the corners of his mind. Lucas didn't sleep well that night. When the morning light finally seeped through the curtains, he dragged himself out of bed, the unease from the previous night still clinging to him. He tried to push it out of his mind as he shuffled to the front door to grab the newspaper. But when he opened the door, something else greeted him, an envelope. Unmarked. Plain. He hesitated for a moment, dread curling in his stomach. His hand trembled as he picked it up, tearing the top open. Inside were photographs, images that made his blood run cold. The first photo was of him, at the park, doing pull-ups. The angle was distant but unmistakable, it was him, taken last night. He flipped to the next one, and his heart nearly stopped. It was his house, a shot of his bedroom window. And then, the final picture, a close-up of him, lying in bed, sleeping. Lucas felt a rush of panic, bile rising in his throat. Someone had been outside his house, watching him. The same man. The one from the street lamp. His mind raced as he scanned the neighborhood, but the street was quiet, deceptively normal. He stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The photos were still clutched in his hand as the whisper returned, louder this time, more insistent. Lucas. The photos burned in his hand as Lucas drove to the police station, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He could still feel the man's eyes on him, the whisper echoing in his head. When he arrived at the station, he wasted no time, bursting through the door and slamming the photographs down in front of Officer Rachel Kim. "These were on my doorstep this morning," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Someone's been watching me." Officer Kim flipped through the photos, her brow furrowing slightly. "Where did you get these?" she asked. "I told you, they were left at my house. Someone's been following me. Watching me. Look at the last one, it's of me, sleeping." She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "We'll look into it, but it could just be a prank. Maybe someone trying to scare you." Lucas' frustration boiled over. "A prank? They were outside my window." He pointed to the photograph. "This isn't some joke." Officer Kim sighed, handing the photos back. "We'll increase patrols in your area. But for now, I wouldn't worry too much. These things happen. Sometimes people just push boundaries. We'll look into it." Her words felt like a dismissal, and Lucas knew it. The rage simmered beneath his skin as he stormed out of the station, the photos crumpled in his hand. As he stepped outside, he could feel it again, the eyes. Watching. Following. The paranoia tightened its grip, and Lucas knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. The drive home felt heavier, darker. As Lucas pulled into his driveway, he glanced in the rearview mirror, and there, standing at the edge of the street, was the man again. The same tall, gaunt figure, his eyes locked on Lucas. But when Lucas whipped his head around to look, the figure was gone. The whisper echoed softly in his mind, chilling him to his core. The low hum of heavy machinery filled the air, blending with the sound of hammers striking metal. The scent of wet cement clung to everything, mixing with the heat of the morning sun. Lucas wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to shake the unease that had followed him into the day. His mind was still clouded by the events of the previous night, the man beneath the street lamp, the whisper of his name. He couldn't shake it. He raised his hammer, driving another nail into place, but his focus was shattered. His eyes darted around the construction site, scanning the workers moving through their daily routines. Everything seemed normal, but that didn't bring him any comfort. As he struck another nail, something in the corner of his eye made him stop. There, at the edge of the site, stood him, the man from the park. Lucas' heart lurched in his chest. The man was still, his figure sharp against the rising sunlight. His gaze was fixed on Lucas, that same invasive stare, unwavering and cold. The tools in Lucas' hands felt heavier as his pulse quickened. His breathing became shallow, and for a brief moment, the noise of the site faded away, replaced by the blood pounding in his ears. Their eyes locked, and the world seemed to slow. Then, a colleague passed in front of him, and the connection was broken. Lucas blinked, and when he looked back, the man was gone. He scanned the site frantically, searching for any trace of him, but the spot where the man had stood was now empty. He lowered the hammer, his hand shaking slightly. Was that real? Lucas swallowed hard, his mind racing. Maybe the man was following him. Or maybe it was all in his head. He wasn't sure which option was worse. The boundary between reality and his imagination felt fragile, like a thread about to snap. Lucas tried to continue working, but his thoughts spiraled. He couldn't focus. He had to stay vigilant, he couldn't let his guard down again. The day passed in a blur, but the night brought no peace. Lucas lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sight of the man at the construction site over and over in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that expressionless face, felt those eyes boring into him. The whisper from the park echoed through his thoughts. It was late past midnight, and the house was silent. Outside, the occasional hum of a passing car broke the stillness, but inside, everything was still. Too still. Just as Lucas started to drift into a restless sleep, a knock shattered the silence. His eyes snapped open, his body frozen. The knock came again, sharp and insistent. His heart raced, each beat pounding in his chest. He strained his ears, waiting for a third knock, but it didn't come. The house was quiet again, but Lucas could feel the tension crawling along his skin. Grabbing the bat he had stashed under his bed, he slipped out of the covers and tiptoed toward the door, his bare feet making no sound on the floor. He approached the front door cautiously, gripping the bat tightly. Peering through the peephole, his breath hitched, there was no one there. His stomach twisted as he backed away from the door. Had he imagined it? The adrenaline in his veins said otherwise. He moved to the windows, checking each one, his eyes scanning the dark street outside. Nothing. No shadows, no figures lurking in the corners. It was as if the knock had never happened, but Lucas knew better. He stepped back into the living room, his nerves on edge. He was being watched. He could feel it. The whisper of his name crept back into his mind, sending chills down his spine. Lucas. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the darkness, bat in hand, waiting. Waiting for something to happen. Morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room. Lucas' eyes burned with exhaustion, but sleep had never come. He moved like a man in a daze, his thoughts clouded by paranoia and fear. Everything felt off kilter, like the world around him had shifted slightly, leaving him stranded. Stepping outside to get some fresh air, Lucas froze at the sight of another envelope waiting for him on the front porch. Unmarked, just like the one before. A knot of dread twisted in his gut as he picked it up, tearing it open with trembling fingers. Inside were more photos, fresh ones. His hands shook as he flipped through them, his pulse pounding louder with each one. These weren't like the others. These were more intimate, closer, as if the photographer had been following him through his day. There were pictures of him at work, hammer in hand, eyes scanning the construction site. But the last photo made his blood run cold. It was of him, sitting on the couch last night, bat in hand, staring into the darkness. From inside his house. His breath came in ragged gasps as panic gripped him. Someone had been in his home. While he sat there, thinking he was alone, someone had been watching him. His skin crawled, and his mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. How could this be happening? Without thinking, Lucas bolted for his car, the photos still clenched in his hand. He had to get to the police, someone had to take this seriously. But as he drove, every shadow, every passing pedestrian seemed to follow him. The paranoia was tightening its grip, and Lucas could feel himself slipping further into it. The police station was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the panic surging through Lucas. He stormed into Officer Kim's office, slamming the photos down on her desk, his hands trembling. "Look at these," he demanded, his voice edged with desperation. "Someone's following me. They've been inside my house." Officer Kim picked up the photos, flipping through them slowly. Her expression was calm, controlled. Too controlled. She glanced up at him, her brow furrowed. "Lucas, I understand you're upset, but it's possible this is an elaborate prank. Maybe someone from work." "A prank?" Lucas nearly shouted. "You think someone's sneaking into my house as a joke?" She sighed, placing the photos back on her desk. "There's no concrete evidence that anyone's broken into your house. The photos don't prove that the person was inside. We'll increase patrols in your area, but I really think you need to try and stay calm. These things, they can get out of hand." Lucas' frustration boiled over. "Out of hand? I'm being watched, and you're telling me to calm down?" Officer Kim remained steady, her tone softening. "Lucas, I'm taking this seriously, but we need to stay rational. I'll keep an eye on it, but I need you to be careful. Don't do anything rash." Lucas didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed the photos and stormed out of the station, anger and fear churning inside him. She wasn't going to help him. No one was. As he stepped out into the daylight, Lucas felt the paranoia intensify. Was she part of it? Was everyone part of it? His mind raced as the thought took hold, what if even the police were watching him? Lucas tried to keep himself together, but the world felt like it was closing in on him. He stopped at a cafe, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, but as he sat down with his coffee, his eyes caught something that made his stomach drop. The man from the park was sitting in the corner, his gaze locked on Lucas. That same, unnerving stare. Lucas' heart pounded in his chest. He blinked, and the man was gone. Later, at the grocery store, Lucas thought he was safe, surrounded by people. But as he passed the frozen food section, he spotted the man's reflection in the glass door. Lucas spun around, but there was no one there. It happened everywhere. The man was always there, at the edge of his vision, in the reflections, in the shadows. Lucas couldn't tell what was real anymore. Every face seemed suspicious, every person a potential threat. The paranoia was all-consuming, and Lucas felt himself sinking deeper into it with every passing moment. By the time Lucas returned home, his mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who was this man? Why was he following him? And why couldn't anyone else see it? The isolation that had once been his comfort now felt like a prison. That night, as he sat in his bedroom, the whisper came again. Lucas. He grabbed the bat, heart pounding, and opened the door to his dark hallway. But there was nothing, just the cold, empty air. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to end this. He had to find the man and confront him, no matter what it took. Tomorrow, the hunt would begin. Lucas' house had become a war room. The once neat living room was now a chaotic web of photos, papers, and hastily scribbled notes. Red strings connected different locations on a makeshift map pinned to the wall: his home, the park, the construction site, every place where he had seen him. His laptop, which had once been used for work or watching movies, now displayed blurry surveillance footage from nearby stores, captured in his frantic attempts to catch the man lurking in the background. It had been days since Lucas had gotten a good night's sleep. His once sharp features were now hollow, his eyes bloodshot, dark circles forming beneath them. Every waking moment was consumed by the hunt. He'd cut back his work hours, barely able to focus on anything other than the man who had invaded his life. His obsession was complete. The photographs haunted him, especially the one of him sleeping. As he sat at his cluttered table, he examined it for the 100th time, his eyes catching a detail he had somehow missed before: a shadow, barely visible in the corner. It wasn't just the stalker taking the photo. Someone, or something, had been standing just out of the frame. A chill crept up Lucas' spine as he stared at the image. The man had been closer than he thought. The realization tightened the grip of paranoia around his mind. His hands trembled as he set the photo down, the pieces falling into place in his head. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed to take action. Fueled by the shadowy figure in the photo, Lucas gathered his things, grabbing a bat from the corner of the room. He wouldn't sit and wait for the stalker to strike again. Now, he was hunting. Downtown buzzed with life as people hurried along the sidewalks, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Lucas' mind. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved through the crowds, his eyes scanning every face, searching for him. The city seemed brighter today, but the light only intensified Lucas' paranoia. Every shadow felt like a threat, every glance from a passerby another reminder that the man could be anywhere, watching. And then he saw him. Across the street, standing still in the middle of the bustling crowd, was the man from the park. His blank, unreadable face was locked onto Lucas, his presence like a dark cloud among the sea of people. Lucas froze, his breath catching in his throat. This was it. The sounds of blaring horns and pedestrians faded into the background as Lucas bolted across the street, narrowly avoiding traffic. His pulse roared in his ears as he pushed through the crowd, his eyes never leaving the figure. The man stood there for a moment longer, watching, before turning and disappearing into the alleyway. Lucas didn't hesitate. He sprinted after him, shoving people aside, his mind a whirlwind of rage and fear. The chase led him through narrow alleyways, past empty storefronts, and into a construction site under renovation. Lucas' breaths came in short, panicked bursts as he cornered the man near the scaffolding. "Stop!" Lucas shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. He reached out, grabbing the man's shoulder and spinning him around. But as soon as their eyes met, Lucas' heart dropped. It wasn't him. The man stared at Lucas, wide-eyed, terrified. He was just an innocent stranger who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm sorry. I thought," Lucas stammered, backing away in confusion. His mind reeled, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The stranger stammered something about being lost and quickly slipped away, leaving Lucas standing alone in the shadow of the scaffolding, trembling with embarrassment and anger. His hands shook, and for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Am I losing my grip on reality? Shaken, Lucas returned to his car, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real man, was toying with him, always staying one step ahead. Back at home, the walls of Lucas' mind continued to close in. His hands fumbled with the lock as he bolted the door behind him, his eyes darting around the darkened room. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the shadows, felt like a warning. He didn't feel safe anywhere, not even in his own house. He slumped into the chair at his desk, staring at the photographs, the notes, the strings connecting each moment of his slow unraveling. His mind raced, replaying the day's events, trying to understand why the man had vanished again. The frustration bubbled over. He slammed his fist onto the table, scattering papers to the floor. The phone rang. Lucas barely acknowledged it, letting it buzz endlessly. Jake had been calling. Officer Kim had left voicemails, trying to calm him down, trying to convince him that this was all in his head. But Lucas knew better. They didn't understand. No one understood. As the night deepened, the house seemed to come alive. The shadows in the corners grew darker, more pronounced. The creaks in the walls felt deliberate, as if someone or something was moving through the house, watching him. The whisper returned, soft at first, but unmistakable. Lucas. He shot up from his chair, gripping the bat tightly, his heart thudding in his chest. The whisper seemed to come from all directions, but when he checked the rooms, they were empty. His breath quickened, panic rising. The stalker was inside. He had to be. He sat in the middle of the darkened living room, holding the bat like a lifeline, eyes darting toward every sound, every movement in the shadows. The silence felt oppressive, each moment stretching longer than the last. Then, a floorboard creaked behind him. Lucas spun around, bat raised, but there was nothing. Just the empty, cold room. Desperate for control, Lucas made up his mind. He couldn't trust the police. He couldn't even trust himself anymore. But if he planned it right, he could trap the stalker. He had to trap him. The park was eerily quiet that night, the air thick with the weight of anticipation. Lucas crouched low behind a tree, his heart hammering in his chest. He had set up small, subtle traps throughout the park, broken twigs, disturbed leaves, markers that would let him know if the man had moved through the area. He was determined not to be caught off guard this time. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and his bat, Lucas waited, the minutes ticking by agonizingly slowly. The silence pressed down on him, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Every time the breeze picked up, Lucas jerked his head, convinced the man was creeping closer. His grip on the bat tightened with each passing moment. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The isolation deepened, and doubt began to gnaw at the edges of Lucas' mind. What if this was all for nothing? What if he wasn't coming? And then, the sound he had been waiting for, a twig snapped behind him. Lucas' heart leapt into his throat as he spun around, shining his flashlight into the darkness. There, just beyond the beam, a figure moved toward him. It was him. The man from the park. Lucas' breath quickened. His hands trembled as the figure stepped closer. This was it, the confrontation he had been waiting for. Every muscle in his body tensed as he prepared for the inevitable showdown. The man stepped into the light, and Lucas lunged, swinging the bat with all the force he could muster. The camera fell to the ground, forgotten, as the adrenaline surged through his veins. But something was wrong. The man wasn't fighting back. He stood there, hands raised in defense, his face twisted in confusion and fear. Lucas blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't the stalker. The realization hit him like a wave of nausea. The man in front of him wasn't the figure who had haunted his every waking moment, it was a jogger, an innocent passerby who had stumbled into Lucas' madness. Lucas' grip on the bat slackened, his arms falling to his sides as horror washed over him. The jogger, dazed and terrified, scrambled away, disappearing into the night. Lucas stood there, trembling, staring at the blood-stained bat in his hands, the enormity of what he had done sinking in. He fell to his knees, the weight of his actions crushing him. He had lost control. He had gone too far. As Lucas stumbled back to his car, his mind whirling, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. But something was wrong. The face staring back at him wasn't his own. It was him. The man from the park. Only this time, the man looked just like Lucas. Lucas stumbled into his house just as the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. He was drenched in sweat, his body heavy with exhaustion. The weight of what had happened at the park, the bat, the innocent man, the blood pulled him down like a stone. He could still feel the grip of the bat in his hand, could still hear the thud of impact in his mind. He headed to the bathroom, desperate to wash away the night, to clear his head. Splashing cold water onto his face, he leaned over the sink, breathing heavily. For a moment, the shock of the water grounded him. But when he glanced up at the mirror, something froze him in place. His reflection stared back at him. But it wasn't his reflection. Not really. There was something wrong, something off about the way the figure in the mirror looked at him. Its eyes were colder, more predatory, the expression on its face subtly twisted. Lucas blinked, shaking his head, but when he looked back, the reflection hadn't changed. It was still watching him, unblinking, as if it were alive. His pulse quickened. The reflection smirked. Lucas recoiled, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over his feet as panic surged through him. The image in the mirror didn't move, but it seemed to taunt him, a twisted version of himself silently mocking him from behind the glass. His breath came in ragged gasps. This isn't real. This can't be real. But it was. The reflection watched as Lucas turned and fled the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, followed him into the rest of the house. No matter where he went, the reflection was with him, lurking just out of sight. Lucas' mind raced, the edges of his sanity fraying. The man from the park, he wasn't just following him. He was inside him, controlling him, watching his every move. Lucas locked himself in the bedroom, but it didn't matter. The reflection, the stalker, was already inside. There was no escape. The next few days blurred together. Lucas cut himself off from the outside world. His phone rang constantly, Jake, Officer Kim, but he ignored it all. He didn't trust them. He didn't trust anyone anymore. His house became a fortress, the windows covered, the doors locked. The outside world was a threat, full of eyes, full of danger. He spent hours staring at his reflection, but it was never the same as before. In the mirror, the windows, even the sheen of his phone screen, the face staring back at him had changed. Sometimes, it sneered at him. Other times, it seemed to be laughing silently, mocking his fear. Every reflection seemed to twist and morph, becoming something darker, more menacing. Lucas began to lose track of time. His thoughts fragmented, slipping away from him like grains of sand. He could feel the man from the park digging deeper into his mind, manipulating his every thought. The paranoia wrapped itself around him, tightening its grip with every passing hour. The whispers from the park returned, but they were no longer outside his head. Now, they came from within, soft, insistent, and growing louder. Lucas. The sound was maddening. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The whispers continued, echoing inside his mind. He couldn't escape them. He couldn't escape himself. The realization was slow but inevitable. The stalker wasn't outside. He was inside, controlling him, shaping his thoughts, driving him to the brink of madness. A loud banging jolted Lucas from his spiraling thoughts. He blinked, disoriented, as he realized someone was at the door. For a moment, he thought it might be the stalker, finally come to finish him. But then he heard Jake's voice filtering through the door. "Lucas, open up." Lucas froze, his hand hovering over the bat that lay nearby. Jake. He hadn't heard from him in days, and now here he was, demanding to be let in. But something in Lucas' twisted mind began to warp the situation. What if Jake wasn't here to help? What if he was part of the conspiracy? What if Jake was working with the stalker? Jake's voice softened. "Lucas, come on, man. I'm worried about you. We can figure this out together." Lucas backed away from the door, his mind racing. Jake sounded sincere, but Lucas knew better. The reflection in the mirror had told him the truth. No one could be trusted. Not Jake, not the police, not even his own mother. The whispers grew louder. "Don't open the door. Don't let him in." Lucas' eyes darted toward the bat. He grabbed it, clutching it tightly as the fear twisted into anger. Jake kept knocking, kept pleading, but all Lucas could hear was the whispering, telling him that Jake was a threat. He was part of the plan to drive Lucas mad. Finally, after what felt like hours, the banging stopped. Jake left. But the damage had been done. Lucas' heart raced, his body trembling with fear and adrenaline. He collapsed onto the floor, clutching the bat as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Alone once again, Lucas' paranoia deepened. He could feel the web of conspiracy tightening around him. There was only one way to escape it. He had to confront the stalker, head on. Late that night, Lucas found himself staring into the mirror once more. The whispers hadn't stopped. They never would. But now, as he looked into the glass, his reflection was no longer a mere copy of himself. It was something else, something twisted, malevolent. The reflection stared at him with cold, unblinking eyes. And then, without moving its lips, it spoke. "You were never being followed," the voice in his head whispered. "You were the one following. You were the stalker, Lucas. All along." Lucas' breath caught in his throat. The words echoed in his mind, each one landing like a punch to the gut. No, that couldn't be true. He hadn't been the one stalking himself. Had he? His mind reeled, but the reflection remained calm, watching him with that twisted smile. "You can't escape me," it whispered. "I'll always be here. In every shadow. In every mirror." Lucas' hands tightened around the bat, his knuckles white with tension. He couldn't take it anymore. With a primal scream, he swung the bat at the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 jagged pieces. The sound echoed through the house, a violent crash that left him panting, chest heaving. But even as the mirror shattered, the reflection remained. Fractured and distorted, but still there, watching him from the shards scattered across the floor. The laughter started deep in Lucas' chest, a manic, hollow sound that echoed through the empty room. He laughed until tears streamed down his face, the realization hitting him all at once: he couldn't escape. He had never been running from anyone else. He had been running from himself. The house was silent again, except for Lucas' broken laughter. The truth had broken something inside him, and he knew now there was no escape. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a pale glow across the room. Lucas stirred, his body aching as he woke on the floor, surrounded by the broken shards of the mirror. The events of the night before felt like a fever dream, but as he sat up, the memories came rushing back. His eyes landed on something scattered across the floor: photographs. But these weren't the same photos he had obsessed over before. These were different. They showed him. Lucas' hands shook as he flipped through the images. There he was, taking pictures of his house, his car, even his own sleeping form. His mind reeled, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. He had been the one behind the camera. The stalker had never been real. It had always been him, stalking himself, driven mad by his own paranoia. Every whisper, every sighting, it was all in his head. His breathing became erratic as he reached the final photo, the one that broke him completely. It was of him, standing in front of the shattered mirror, bat in hand, a wide-eyed smile on his face. And then he saw it, the camera. It was set up in his room, capturing every moment of his descent into madness. Lucas' vision blurred as tears welled up in his eyes. The truth was unbearable. Lucas collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of his psychosis. But just as he began to process the full extent of his unraveling, he heard it again. "Lucas." The whisper came from behind him, soft and insistent. This time, he knew it was real. He turned slowly, the bat still in his hand, ready to face whatever was waiting for him. Lucas sat on the cold floor of his bedroom, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. Shattered glass glittered in the dim morning light filtering through the blinds, the fragments of his reflection still haunting him from every angle. The photographs lay scattered, their edges torn from his frantic hands. They were no longer just images of his paranoia, they were pieces of a puzzle he wasn't ready to solve. The whispering had become constant now, no longer soft and distant but sharp, cutting through the silence like knives. Lucas, his name echoed from every shadow, every corner of the room. The air felt thick, suffocating, pressing down on him as though the walls themselves were closing in. Sweat dripped down his face, his grip tightening on the bat in his hand. His knuckles were white, his heart hammering in his chest. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, but Lucas wasn't ready to face it, not yet. The feeling of being watched hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had intensified. Another whisper. This time, louder. Lucas. He jerked his head up, eyes darting around the room, convinced that someone was there. But there was no one. No person, no figure. Only the stalker. And he was always watching. Slowly, Lucas rose to his feet, the bat heavy in his hand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were circling around him, closing in like predators. He couldn't tell if they were inside his head or if they were coming from the darkness itself. But one thing was certain, it was time to face the stalker. With trembling hands, Lucas made his way through the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that danced along the walls sent chills down his spine. He was on edge, waiting for the confrontation that he knew was inevitable. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, the air cold and still. Lucas crept forward, bat raised, his body tense with fear and anticipation. The whispers followed him, echoing in his ears, wrapping around him like a vice. And then he stopped. He could feel it, a presence behind him. He was no longer alone. Slowly, Lucas turned, his breath catching in his throat. There, at the end of the hallway, stood the stalker. But it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't the faceless man who had haunted his every step. It was him. His reflection, the twisted doppelganger that had been lurking in the shadows all along, only now it was real, standing in the flesh before him. The stalker smiled, a sickening, twisted version of Lucas' own expression. His eyes gleamed with malice, a reflection of every dark thought, every hidden fear Lucas had ever buried. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, the silence between them heavy and suffocating. Lucas' heart pounded, the realization crashing over him like a wave. This was the moment, the final revelation. He had been the stalker all along. Every photograph, every whisper, every creeping sensation, it had been his mind splitting, creating a monster to haunt him, a manifestation of all his fears, his guilt, his anger. The stalker's lips twisted into a cruel smile, his voice low and mocking. "You can't run from yourself." Lucas gripped the bat tighter, his mind spinning. He knew what he had to do. He had to end this, once and for all. But as the truth weighed down on him, he felt it crushing him, threatening to drag him under. With a roar of frustration, Lucas lunged forward, swinging the bat with all his strength, aiming for the stalker's head. But the figure moved with an eerie precision, dodging every strike with effortless grace. The bat slammed into the walls, shattering glass and overturning furniture as Lucas thrashed wildly, his desperation mounting with every failed attempt. The room became a blur of chaos, the sounds of destruction filling the air. The stalker stayed just out of reach, his twisted smile never faltering. He circled Lucas, taunting him with soft whispers, his voice dripping with malice. "You can't escape this," the stalker whispered, leaning in close. "You never could." The fight was brutal, chaotic. Lucas swung and swung, but it was no use. The harder he fought, the clearer the truth became. This was a battle he couldn't win. He wasn't fighting the stalker, he was fighting his own mind, his own reflection. Sweat poured down his face as he stumbled back, panting, his body trembling with exhaustion. The bat slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. He couldn't do this anymore. The realization hit him with a crushing finality. He had lost. He collapsed to his knees, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The stalker stood over him, watching, unshaken, as Lucas' final defenses crumbled. "What have I done?" Lucas whispered, his voice breaking. As the morning light filtered through the broken windows, the room fell eerily silent. Lucas knelt there, broken, as the full weight of the truth began to settle in. Lucas remained on the floor, his body shaking as the memories began to flood back, vivid, painful memories of everything he had done during his descent into madness. The photographs, The stalking, the whispers, none of it had come from anyone else. It had all been him. But something darker emerged from the depths of his fractured mind. Images flashed before his eyes: the night at the park, the confrontation with the jogger, the violent swing of the bat. His hands trembled as the truth fully revealed itself. He hadn't just scared the jogger, he had killed him. And the other victims? They were innocent too. Strangers caught in the crossfire of his delusions. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind had fractured, creating a narrative where he was the victim, when all along, he had been the monster. The blood on his hands was real. The lives he had taken real. Lucas looked down at his shaking hands, still coated with blood from the night before. His stomach churned with nausea, the weight of his actions too much to bear. There was no one left to blame but himself. The truth settled over Lucas like a shroud. There was no escaping what he had done, no running from the consequences. His mind had twisted everything, and now, he was trapped in the prison of his own making. The house was drenched in silence, the soft morning light filtering through the wreckage of Lucas' life. The echoes of sirens began to drift through the air, growing louder with each passing moment. The police were coming. Drawn by the trail of bodies he had left in his wake, they would be here soon. There was no escaping what he had become, no escaping the monster that had taken root inside him. Lucas sat in the middle of the living room, surrounded by broken glass, overturned furniture, and the scattered remnants of his shattered mind. His reflection was everywhere, staring back at him from every surface, reminding him that no matter where he went, he would never truly escape. The sirens grew closer, flashing lights dancing outside the windows. Lucas closed his eyes, his mind flickering between moments of clarity and madness. The whispering had softened, but it was still there, lingering like a ghost in the back of his mind. Lucas, the voice was fainter now, but still present. It would never leave him. Not in prison, not when the doors closed behind him. The stalker would always be there, because the stalker was him. As the police lights flashed brighter, Lucas smiled faintly, resigned to his fate. He knew what came next. The door burst open, and the officers stormed in, but before they could speak, Lucas whispered softly to himself, "You can't run from yourself." The final sound he heard, just before the police pulled him to his feet, was the whisper of his name, spoken from the darkness one last time. Lucas, now handcuffed, was led away from the wreckage of his life, his face blank and emotionless. The whispers followed him, echoing in his mind, a reminder that no matter where he went, he would never escape. He was never running from anyone else. He had always been running from himself.